tonight we conclude a robust fall schedule for activities that have grown out of the Center for Global Theology. It's wonderful to have the lineup, think about it in terms of baseball, the lineup that we've had this fall in terms of raising our global awareness. Wonderful to have Audie speaking last night. And lest I subvert the introduction, I'm going to invite my colleague, Professor Norma Cook-Everest, to introduce.
It is good to see so many people here. We've had a very full fall. Reverend Dr. Karen Bloomquist, who served as Associate Professor of Ethics at Wartburg Seminary from 1997 to 1999, returns home. When she left Wartburg to become Director of Theological Studies in the Department of Lutheran World Federation in Geneva, she remained as Adjunct Professor of Wartburg, and she honors us with that connection. Karen is a graduate of Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary and received her PhD from Union Seminary, New York, working with Dorothy Soleil. Her doctoral dissertation became a book, The Dream Betrayed: Religious Challenge of the Working Class. Since that time, she has taught at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago and served the ELCA as Director for Studies in Church and Society Division, working on some very controversial issues before coming to Wartburg. She is a widely known speaker and author, and I especially appreciate how she has brought so many people to voice, particularly from the global south. She is a well-known speaker and author herself, but she is known, I think, from so many publications through the Lutheran World Federation: Transformative Theological Perspectives, Theological Practices That Matter, and Being the Church in the Midst of Empire, among many other works. She says of herself, "I am a constructive theologian ethicist, pastor, and administrator, committed to preparing the people of God to discern critically and work collaboratively with others to further God's liberating mission in a pluralistic, multi-faith context." And I wrote of you, Karen, she is a collaborative, connectional, global leader seeking justice and living her faith. We have worked together. I think we spoke together for the first time in Denver in 1986. We worked together through the years in many ways, and the three of us have worked together. And I count it a true pleasure to have worked with her and called her my friend over these many decades.
Well, thank you for that gracious invitation. And I was thinking last night as I was sitting listening to you, this was the room that I was doing a lecture in probably 15 years ago when Wartburg was deciding whether or not to invite me to be on the faculty. So it is in many ways a coming home kind of experience. And as I was sharing with the faculty this noon, in a remarkable way, there's a sense in which the ethos that is Wartburg Seminary has been something that I've really carried with me, even though I wasn't, kind of mournfully not a part of the faculty then, because I really enjoyed the sense of community interaction here. But certainly the ethos of here is something that I very much carried with me, including the fact that right now I happen to be serving interim pastor at a very rural congregation, and I say, yeah, there's something here that resonates with what Wartburg is good at. So, what I'm going to talk about tonight is not so much this is the global church or the global south, but it is undergirding what I'm saying. Because since returning to the U.S. over 2 years ago, part of the challenge is how to bring that experience and those perspectives into thinking and challenging us in this country. What does it mean to be the church? So I'm not really talking about the global church per se, but it's implicit in what I've been saying. I've come to the focus, the strange title for tonight, Seeing, Remembering, Connecting That Transforms Us, the Church, the World. I've come to that focus certainly as one who was very much shaped by movements in the 60s and the 70s. In some ways, it was the challenges being raised there that pulled me into studying to become a pastor, especially the challenges related to justice of various kinds, particularly the civil rights and the women's movement then. And then through the years at LSTC, and then in my ELCA position, how the church relates to society has been kind of at the forefront of my concerns. And so part of what I'm trying to work on is to say that the normal ways we've thought about how the church relates to society maybe need to be reconfigured. And how do we think about that in an era that's much different from what, say, the 1950s were, when some of these typologies of, you know, is a church over and against society, is it in paradox with society, etc. There's some of these familiar paradigms that are used. And I'm saying that I think in this time and age, we're facing the need for a new way of putting that together, probably with a much more humble stance of what it means to be the church, but in a way that the church can collaborate with other movements in society, with other faiths, with people who are, quite frankly, not that impressed or even interested in the institutional church. So just to say that that's a little bit of what I'm coming at. And then also within a global horizon, the one refrain that I've repeated a lot is how we are transformed by those who are most different from ourselves. And you know, Sam and I have been talking before about, you know, that I think is one of the things that Wartburg has been known for, and, you know, given for financial and other reasons, you know, we aren't as diverse as we used to be. So how do we think through that reality of how we're transformed by our interaction with those who are most different from ourselves? And actually that really goes back to what for me is one of the central writings in Luther about how through the Eucharist we are changed. You know, not only are the elements of the Eucharist changed, but we are changed through one another. And I'll get back to that kind of theme a little bit later. There's about 4 premises that I want to share first, because each of these could be a whole long lecture in and of themselves, and I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to make some assumptions, and I think they're assumptions of hopefully things that you're familiar with already. The first is that we face huge political, economic, environmental, and cultural crises today. We could go on, and I'm not going to do this whole big litany of rehearsing what all of those are. Secondly, these crises are manifest locally and globally in often interconnected ways. I think we certainly experience that in terms of some of the environmental challenges, when we realize that burning coal in one place has adverse effects in a very different part of the world, etc. And certainly around economic globalization, which is one of the themes that we were working on pretty intensively for some years in the LWF, and doing that ecumenically with others. Thirdly, there are countless examples throughout the Bible and church history where the call is clear to stand and work against all kinds of systemic injustices, and to do so from out of the heart of who we are as the baptized, redeemed people of God. In other words, this is not optional. But as we say in baptism, or in the affirmation of baptism, you know, we promise to work for peace and justice in all the world. That's a pretty demanding kind of call. As one of the theological students that I taught at Seattle University last year commented to me, this is why young people are leaving or becoming disillusioned with the church, because it has lost its nerve and no longer walks the talk. No longer lives out the radical resistance to and transformation of unjust realities. And that is in many ways at the heart of the biblical witness. Fourth, these cries, these ethical challenges out there are not just ethical issues that the church is called to address. And we have to somehow work for this justice issue or for that human rights issue, etc. But these crises deeply infect the church itself, how it views itself, how it operates, and how the church itself is often in bondage. And so it is not just social transformation out there that is called for, but the transformation of the church itself. For it is actually deeply spiritual and theological matters that are at stake. These crises are at their heart spiritual crises. An example of this. At the 2010 assembly of the LWF, this public statement was made, and actually Craig Nesson was there, and he actually helped us work on it a little bit too. The public statement was called Daily Bread Instead of Greed. And in it, structural greed was declared to be a spiritual matter of idolatry. Quote, in the 16th century, the crisis was over the gospel that frees people from the fear and bondage of sin, which became embedded in systems needing to be challenged. Today, people also are in fear and bondage over the sin of greed as embedded in the economic system. They fear what the future will hold unless dramatic changes are made for the sake of global economic and environmental justice. Systemic greed becomes like the domination or bondage of sin that is expressed through the theology of Paul, for example, in Romans 6, and in Luther. It becomes the idol for which lives, communities, and the rest of creation are sacrificed. Notice the theologically implicit ways in which some of that's named. Money and financial markets take on a life of their own, with the creation of an endless variety of new financial instruments for making quick, hyper profits. More than just a medium of exchange, money has become a commodity from which ever larger profits are promised and expected. And when these promises are betrayed, or when the system collapses, as we've been hearing in terms of the situation in Iceland, then I think the undergirding idolatry is exposed. A fifth premise of what I'm saying tonight, and this is probably where this is where much of this is leading. Through the power of the Spirit, we, the church and the world, are transformed by God. Not only by God, but transformed through those who across time and space and life situations are most different from ourselves. So there's a twofold way in which the transformation happens. Yes, it's the transformation that occurs through the Spirit, but it also means transformation that is occurs in more horizontal ways. So, what I'm going to begin by doing is doing some re-envisioning of what it means to be the church in light of these challenges. As we all know, the ecclesiological starting point for Lutherans is that the church is where the word is preached and sacraments celebrated. In other words, practices of washing, of eating, of speaking, of hearing. We don't begin with some essence or ontological sense of the church, but with very practical practices of word and sacrament. So what typically comes to mind are those internal practices for the nurturing of faith of those in the church, or perhaps for connecting with those who don't yet identify with the church, in other words, through various forms of outreach or evangelism. But the focus tends to be in what happens in here, in church, in contrast to out there, the more social, public, prophetic dimensions of ministry. Now, starting with these assumptions often makes it difficult for us to move beyond ways of being church that only reflect our ethnic heritage or are somehow limited to just us and don't expand to a sense of the Catholicity of our faith heritage. It contributes to the tendency to see church as a closed family, isolated from others, rather than embracing those who are different. It's interesting because in the congregation I'm currently serving, they certainly say, oh, we're a family, but they are very different. And so I said, okay, you're a family that embraces differences. Now, some of them still aren't so sure about that, but they're at least hearing me say that. In other words, embraces those who don't necessarily fit into the pre-established family roles. Parker Palmer, some 30 years ago, proposed instead that we think of church as a company of strangers who don't necessarily have that much in common already. And I would join him and add to that being formed as church necessarily involves being with those who are different from us. Further, having our perspectives transformed and we ourselves being transformed by those who are different, who help us to see what we would not otherwise see when bound in by our own subjective-based readings of what is occurring. Being open to how others see, experience, and interpret really does matter. The usual paradigms that the church has for relating to the world out there is that, well, we are fed, we are inspired, we get ourselves together, and then we go out. We reach out to others through evangelism, through outreach, through mission, sharing what we have for the sake of others. But I've noticed again and again that the shortfall of many churches, therefore, is that we often don't seem to get it together enough, namely our internal acts as church or our internal survival as a congregation, to get around to the going out dimensions. Focusing on ourselves, in other words, those already in the church, rather than this much enlarged sense of us, which focusing on the world brings in from the very beginning. The problem is we are obsessed then with what, well, we should do, what we should do to help others, to bring in others into our church, etc. I would contend that it's not so much a matter of our bringing the gospel to the world out there, but, and this is where these focal practices of see, remember, connect come in, we see what is happening in our lives and world. We uncover the illusions that are too often operating there. We remember what God is about and how our faith in a God who became radically incarnate in this world needs to engage with these realities, and we connect the dots. We connect with others. We connect in collaborative actions with others for the sake of the world, thereby moving toward an alternative worldview, interpretation, praxis, way of being in the world. In other words, actually engaging with the realities out there from the beginning, and not just providing a refuge from all that bad stuff occurring out there. So, let's begin with the world. I think it's an important methodological shift in theology to begin not so much by focusing on the formulations of the faith and the church and then move from there to the world, but to begin with the world. What is going on out there becomes a wake-up call to the church. It shakes us up. It gets our attention. I think this happened a year ago many of the things that were happening in the Occupy movement. You know, all of a sudden, they were naming certain injustices, and it was like, oh, well, yeah, that's kind of what we know, is what challenges us at church. But it was almost saying, they're doing it. And many, again, there were people with clerical collars in participating in some of that. But we weren't, as church, in the lead of all of that. For the sake of the world is itself, I think, a significant shift from how 16th century reforming movements tended to be preoccupied with the church and salvation, rather than what was going on in the world. Now, admittedly, Luther, in some of his writings, had a lot to say about some of what was going on in society, but in general, the way we interpreted what the Reformation was about, it was about, church and salvation and those kinds of things. But I would maintain that if Reformation insights are to have an enduring, living significance after 500 years in today's world, a world of massive injustice, illusions, and bankrupt hopes, the church must be able to communicate not only with those who claim the name of Luther or others of the Reformation, but more importantly for the sake of this world that God so loves, John 3:16. The secular realm becomes the focus of attention in a way that was not the case in the 16th century. The theologian John Cobb, for example, contends, and I quote, that participation in the tradition of secularizing the way, capital W, is the most faithful form of Christianity today, unquote. And in a secular society, and the society I live in out in the Pacific Northwest is very secular, very a-church, if not anti-church, I think that can open up new possibilities for how the faith can be embodied and conveyed, particularly among those who are skeptical as to whether the church has anything good to offer the world today. So, beginning with the world involves, first of all, exegeting our context. Understanding what is occurring in the world becomes as critical as good exegesis of the biblical text. And that means ongoing analysis of what is going on today. And it needs to be ongoing. Some of this I started working on some weeks ago, and okay, a week ago, maybe some things changed, maybe they didn't, but it's like the analysis has to keep changing too. Because gospel is in relation to those dominant forces that are shaping our world here and now. If God's good news is really to speak and become incarnate in, engage, and transform those reigning realities that disrupt and destroy the world in which we and all of our creation live, then we have to constantly say, what is that news that is good? Some of this actually comes from Douglas John Hall, whose work I appreciate, so some of you may have heard some of it there. I think it also goes back to one of the LWF consultations we had in Hong Kong about 6 or so years ago, and Dieter Westphal, who teaches at LSTC, used the image of the lock and the key, and he was really challenging these Asian Lutherans to say, okay, does in fact the lock of guilt and all the ways of describing the lock that Luther was addressing in the 16th century, is it the same lock here? And does the key fit in the same way in terms of what's holding people in bondage or whatever? So reconfiguring our theological tradition to say, how can it speak in ways that really are liberating and freeing in relationship, to people today? And I think most people, maybe lifelong Lutherans, might say, oh yes, justification by grace, that's the key. Well, a lot of other people kind of glaze over when we start to say that, and of course finding other ways of talking about what that's getting at is important. A second aspect of this is analyzing how these interstructural realities work together. I'm not going to do a whole lecture here, but three of the touchstones here that I find helpful for kind of exposing or exegeting or analyzing our situation are, first of all, the reality of empire, the various interrelated processes of domination and their effect, or as Jörg Rieger says it in his book, Christ and Empire, massive concentrations of power which permeate all aspects of life and which cannot be controlled by any one actor alone. Resistance to empire is difficult since most people never realize what it is that shapes them, because it reaches all the way down and creates even our deepest desires. A second of these, and again, each of these, I'm assuming there's discussion of some of these at Wartburg already, so I'm not going in, I'm just making quick reference to them. A second is illusions instead of truth. Now, you might especially want to think about that, having just weathered pretty nasty political campaigns. You know, well, who's telling the truth, and what are the illusions being created through the media or whatever. This is a quote by Chris Hedges, who I find particularly provocative in how he analyzes things. We live in imaginary virtual worlds created by corporations that profit from our deception. A public that can no longer distinguish between truth and fiction is left to interpret reality through illusion. The worse reality becomes, the more people seek refuge and comfort in illusions. Lies and distortions become truth, and people can believe whatever they want to believe. Don't bother, don't confuse me with the facts. I want to believe whatever I want to believe. And Hedges says this: blind faith in illusions is our culture's secular version of being born again. Third is the third little thread, not these are big threads, but the third thread I'll just mention briefly is social amnesia. And here I refer to the Canadian philosopher or historian Henry Giroux. Historical consciousness and truth are now sacrificed to the spectacles of consumerism, celebrity culture, hyped-up violence, and market-driven obsession with the self. But the very formative culture that makes compassion, justice, and an engaged citizenry foundational for democracy has been erased from the language of mainstream politics and the various apparatuses that support it. Public values and the public good have now been reduced to nostalgic reminders of another era. So, how does the church come into this? How do we begin to approach this? And each of these, of course, I could go on and on with a lot more detail, but I wanted to just do a touchstone there. An especially urgent calling of churches and other religious folk is to open the space, point to the evidence, and pose the critical questions. I think that's much of what ministry entails. People are acutely feeling betrayed by the promises they have bought into, often with blind faith that now is increasingly feeling betrayed. For example, by large corporate interests determined to keep the markets as free and unregulated as possible. Matters of basic meaning, hope, and values are at stake. And I think this was being played out again and again in the various interviews as to why people were favoring one candidate or another in the recent election. Those matters of meaning, hope, and values should be the forte of the church. But how do we get at that? People, I think, need to be able to grieve their loss and express their resentful sadness about what has been lost, raging for the world that is no more. lamenting for how either European standards of living or U.S. dominance in the world may be waning. The sense of being abandoned, no longer blessed by a God who has been identified with success or being able to get ahead. Walter Brueggemann, who I'm going to refer to later, has said at one place, despair may be the defining pathology of our time, robbing the church of missional energy and stewardship generosity. And I'm bringing those in because I think, what I'm trying to get at is some of the undergirding stuff that I think needs to be rethought, even for those basic things like mission and stewardship that we talk a lot about in the seminary. There is a doubt that doubts God's, or there is a despair that doubts God's fidelity to care and remember, and doubts God's power to save, and therefore other means of salvation are pursued instead. Your great Rieger, R-I-E-G-E-R, has pointed out that, quote, the incarnation, however, is a logic of downturn. The incarnate Jesus transcends a form of immanence determined by the status quo in order to embrace a different form of immanence on the margins. People continue clinging to faith in the American dream because most of the images and aspirations around them are focused on those who have succeeded or who have gotten ahead. And thus, the blind, desperate hope is that I too might make it eventually. I too might win the lottery. And the desire of all grows in proportion to the growing wealth of only a few. So I would suggest that we need to shift decisively where our faith, desire, and hope are lodged. From looking upward to a God on high identified with those who have succeeded, which is, I think, is one of the ways in which imperial ways of thinking affect our ecclesiology, to a God, to looking downward, to those marginalized, left out, impoverished, and despairing, around us, and certainly also around the world. And this, of course, would be God known through a theology of the cross. This calls for resisting desire as it has been constructed and being open to the emergence of alternative desires. Desires that have to do with my good in relation to the good of others. That erupts not from above, but from below, from the underside, as we look outward and pursue solidarity with those who truly are left out around us and around the world. There, as Rieger says, God labors in solidarity with the people, and resisting desire that resists this domination, spreads from there. So, let me turn then, in this last part, and this will go a little bit longer than just the last conclusion, a little bit more about what I mean by seeing, remembering, and connecting. The parishioners among whom I currently pastor are, for the most part, rather conservative, still quite grounded in the ideologies and values that undergird empire. And yet at the same time, they have been deeply formed by practices that regularly move them to reach out to others who may be quite different from themselves. And through this engagement, to begin to see, remember, and connect in ways empowered through their faith that go against the grain of empire. Now, I've only been with them a year, and so I don't want to give any success stories because clearly the rhetoric is still there. But you can feel this uneasiness. I mean, you can't spend a whole year preaching on Mark, without people getting a sense that, there's something that doesn't quite go with some of the American ideology stuff that they bought into. So let me, having mentioned, kind of the empire, the illusion, and the amnesia, let me just give you a sense of how some of this connects with the seeing, remembering, connecting that I think is distinctive to who we are as a church, but also in ways that can open us more readily to the world. People today, first of all, exposing the idolatry. People today, especially here in North America, are in captivity to illusions and false promises, which is why there is strategic importance to the ecclesial practice of seeing beneath the surface of what is promulgated as the way things are. My mentor, Dorothy Zola, has one of her sayings that really stayed with me, is that sin is when life seems to freeze over, when we feel powerless in the face of the reigning realities under which we live, which, quite frankly, I think is very similar to the bondage of sin discussed by St. Paul. Thus, an essential role as church is to find ways to expose or bring to light or make it possible for people to see, not our seeing or naming it for them, but people themselves to see the false promises and idolatries that are holding them and others captive. As Mary Solberg says in her book, Compelling Knowledge, a way of seeing through the cross, an epistemology of the cross, critiques human pretensions to godness and equips us to see reality rightly. It attends to that moment when illusions fall apart, they no longer hold. We begin to see what is the case, to understand our implications in it, and accept accountability to act accordingly. The cross becomes a fulcrum for knowing, the hinge point of true reality, and the gift to see it. To know truly is to know from the margins of life, of sanity, of dignity, of power. Friends of the cross are those who live in the world as it is, without illusions. So what can effectively expose this idolatry and enable us to see? Recently, I think the contradictions between what we're promised and what the reality of our lives are like have become more and more apparent to many people in this society, who now can more readily see and name the contradictions between what the reigning economic logic promises and what it actually delivers. Namely, that there isn't a lot of correlation between whether the stock market is going up and whether the job market is, whether the job situation is improving. So people feel like there's an increasingly betrayed promise in which they're living. And not just the poor and the working class, which was what I was focusing on, how the dream was betrayed when I was working on my doctoral dissertation some 30 years ago. But increasingly, this betrayal is being experienced by many who are middle class, which, quite frankly, in American society is how everyone likes to say they're middle class, or they're striving to become that. But many now are feeling like, or are seen as losers, and become invisible, unfortunately, even in our churches. Forgotten, overlooked, not remembered. And yet who yearn for more than sympathy, but for solidarity that can lead to the transformation of the assumptions, systems, and policies, or the gods to whom they have been sacrificed. Walter Brueggemann points to analogies between the situation of decline today and the situation of exile for the Old Testament Jews. Rather than abandoning faith, wallowing in despair, or retreating to privatized religion, this led instead to daring theological articulations. Good news about God that cannot be suppressed. Read some of the latter chapters of Isaiah, for example. Exiles must be able to grieve their loss and express their resentful sadness about what is lost, raging for a world that is no more, lamenting for the waning of American dominance or of America homogeneity, which is what I think many commentators have pointed to after the election, or raging because of the declining strength or influence of churches. Unless this can be countered and addressed theologically and spiritually, all the mission and stewardship, church growth, and even multicultural strategies may not actually get at the heart of the matter. Instead, through the power of the Spirit, we, the church and the world, are transformed by God, and through those who are different from us across time, space, and situations. This is why I always like to remind us who are Lutherans that in many places around the world, Lutheran churches are in fact the churches of the poor, of the very poor. Certainly that's true in many places of Africa, but you know, thinking of India, where the 2.5 million Lutherans there are for the most part of the Dalit or tribal people, in other words, people who are out of the caste system, and who have that sense of what it means to be church that we need to learn from. Instead of blind faith filled with whatever popular appeal people want to be attracted to, what we need is a substantial, gutsy, well-tested faith, a subversive seeing that takes seriously what is occurring today, that sees patterns, that brings to light systemic injustice and seductive dynamics of empire, and reinterprets biblical theological insights in relation to such. This is a resilient, confessing faith, not one that is complicit with what is occurring, but that can boldly challenge the assumptions, practices, outcomes, in light of the alternative reality of the reign of God, namely that another world is possible. We can see because as those baptized into a new reality, our eyes are open and we are encouraged to see and to discern what we would not otherwise. A second aspect of this movement is the theological practices of subversive remembering. To counter the social amnesia cited above, remembered suffering, and here by remembrance I'm not talking about nostalgia, but practices of remembering who we are in contrast to how others would categorize us, remembering from the underside rather than from the victors, from those left out rather than those who have been beneficiaries of the American dream. We are reminded of how countercultural, even subversive, were the communities gathered around Jesus, who were daily and vividly being reminded of how they were oppressed by empire. And so again, as Brugman says, Scripture is a subversion, a rendering of reality that lives under the dominant version. I have a lot more here in terms of biblical stuff, but you've got such great biblical professors here that I think you've probably been exposed to that already anyway. So the challenge is, how can we, in ministry with the typical North American congregations, go about this? Now in North America, as Lutheran churches, we typically do not see ourselves as churches of the oppressed, even though that has been part of our immigrant history. We tend to be among those who have made it, at least somewhat. And yet it is that very script of upward mobility of the promise of the American dream that needs to be named, faced, and questioned, because of how it helps to legitimize some of the structural realities that exacerbate the injustices. So what I'm calling for is a kind of truth-telling that emerges through this subversive remembering. Subversive remembering of who and whose we are in relationship to God, subversive remembering of what has come before us, and subversive remembering of the realities of our neighbors globally as well as locally. Subversive remembering is a theologically empowered social practice of expressing when or who or what has been forgotten or overlooked. It exposes our illusions, our false gods, and the domination and injustice they perpetuate, and impels truth-telling and organized action for the sake of God's world. And I think I have a whole section here about how that happens through preaching. And the preacher standing to preach among exiles and narrating and nurturing a counter-identity. Or as we gather for the Eucharist, remembering and telling the tale of how we gather. I taught a course online through Philadelphia Seminary and had a wonderful Catholic nun who actually teaches at a college there. And she did a lot of interesting stuff with the subversive memory, how subversive memory that denounces our own complicity in the injustice that holds us in bondage. So there's a lot of material. Johann Metz, the German Catholic theologian, and a number of others who raised up that crucial category of remembering. But I want to quickly move on to the practice of connecting. Practices of connecting more explicitly counter the fragmentation and exclusion that is pervasive today. Here I lean into a much more communal understanding of church or ecclesia, a worldview of relationality instead of individualism. Instead of aspiring to be self-sufficient churches, a deeper sense of our interrelatedness. Instead of our strength or know-how, and typical American traits, our vulnerability, our openness to listen and to learn from others, and to even be transformed by those from ourselves who are different from ourselves, rather than always quickly trying to speak and show others. Shifting from the arrogance of empire and theologies of success to attitudes of humility that are shaped by a theology of the cross. And so for this, I think we need to go back to the original meaning of church based on that Greek notion of ecclesia, which designated the public assembly of free citizens of a Greek city-state who were called together to speak freely and deliberate publicly on matters of life and justice in their city. When the Greek city-states found their governments had become too corrupt or oppressive, they would call for an ecclesia, an assembly outside the civil authority of the city. And if enough people came out and refused to accept what was going on, that government would collapse. Now, of course, in the New Testament, Paul drew upon this and further developed this to refer to the church as the new community created in and through Jesus Christ. But what is important for our purposes here is to realize how closely that original intent of ecclesia, the power of persons in community to influence their corporate lives and the world for good or ill, is strikingly similar to what has been occurring in various public settings, for example, of the Occupy movement in our day. The clear objective is to put democratic processes back in the hands of the people. So I would suggest that ecclesia becomes a place of seeing, remembering, and connecting, of putting together what is fragmentary, pointing to what is true, enabling us to see and act, including in organized actions with others. It implies the long-term challenge of nurturing and organizing communities of resistance against the dominant scripts and injustice that they entail, which I think has been true of was true of much of the New Testament church in its struggle in the midst of empire. And communities that today are intentionally collaborative across boundaries of religion, geography, and self-interest. Let me just, I could go on and on, there's more I have here, but I want to especially conclude with a particular concrete case study or example of the seeing, remembering, and connecting, because it's one that has really spoken to me deeply in the last month. Some of you heard me make mention earlier that our community out there is facing a huge issue of will our area become the coal terminal, the largest coal terminal in North America to ship over 50 million tons of coal each year to China. And there's a strong environmental movement and others that are fighting this, etc. And I, along with others, have said, well, can't we as faith communities be saying something and discovering it's very hard to organize faith communities out there. But then about the end of September, the Lummi Indians, and they have quite a pivotal reservation right there on the waterfront where this coal terminal is proposed to be built by large, huge corporate interests. And they said, okay, come to Cherry Point, this is where it's to be. Now, they set it up, and note these categories are important. They had big signs, holy ground, Jerusalem, Gettysburg, Cherry Point. The ground was very sacred to them because they remembered the thousands of years that their ancestors' bones had been buried in that very land. They remembered how many of them they're mainly fisher folk, so how many had lost their lives at sea, the smallpox bay where, and then of course the colonialism and all those kinds of dynamics. And then they connected. And they were connecting with a wider community. Their symbol became the symbol that empowered the rest of us. Some of us surmise that there have been attempts by the corporations to buy off some of the native folks, saying, oh, you'll get some jobs if we get this. Well, instead, they had a strong stance of resistance, and this isn't always typical of this particular group. So this was a new breakthrough. A huge facsimile, cardboard, bigger than this, a check for millions of dollars, they had stamped across it, non-negotiable. And there, actually, some representatives of the company had been there to witness this too, along with a few hundred of us. And then they ceremoniously burned it as part of their, and they were in full regalia, etc. And 2 weeks later, they called us together again because they were going to be engaging not just in the seeing and the remembering, but the connecting. Now, they weren't necessarily using these words, but it was pretty obvious that these were the kinds of words that made sense. They said it's important that we stand in solidarity with the other fishers and the non-native commercial fishers there, and the native, there's often been a lot of real tensions. But, so they had arranged it, and there were about 20 of these big fishing boats out there, just beyond the water, all with no coal signs and whatever. And symbolically, one of the crab fishers came and dumped his pot of crabs he had caught with the Lummi Indians. There was a mingling of the crabs from the two. Again, they weren't necessarily doing this as a liturgical act. But for those of us who understand the tradition and remember that, those symbols and how they were used came alive in some powerful kinds of ways. Now, whether the resistance movement against this will work out, I don't know. People in my congregation are saying, well, we need those coal jobs. But then they're saying, oh, there's illusions about how many jobs there really would be. And is it possible for us to work together and develop common ground? So some of us are beginning to develop a very fragile coalition of faith community leaders and union leaders to look in different ways at that. So, again, that's a very partial thing. It may end up being, you know, a month from now we may say, oh, you know, it's a total disaster. But there's a real sign of hope there, that something can be. And there's a spiritual depth there. And it's really important that the churches are not at the forefront, not only because we're not very strong, but because of these other faiths. You know, it's the Buddhists, it's the Jews, it's the Sikhs, and the native people who really need to take the lead. And the church saying, yeah, how can this be a wake-up call? Of saying, yes, we now need to collaborate with that too. So that's the kind of dynamic that I'm trying to get at of how then do we be church in a much different way with those kinds of realities. So I'll close with that.
I was in a study where someone was talking about how we report out activities of congregations, and that, you know, what we report to the larger church tends to be inward focused. And he was suggesting we have to change kind of the report card. Do we just measure how many members we have, or do we measure how many contacts we've made in the mall or something like that? Have you been in any settings where congregations have actually tried to change the reporting card and scheme of it?
Well, I can tell you the church I'm serving, the congregation I'm serving now, it doesn't work to do the usual parochial reports because it's like, well, right now I'm trying to figure out who is a member and who isn't, because when they get around calling a pastor, that matters. Well, everybody's together in the directory, and well, so-and-so comes to this book club or to whatever, and quite frankly, all the members we receive this year are people who become a part of the family before they officially join, and so it doesn't make sense. It was interesting because the same congregation, for their evangelism committee, they said, oh, Birch Bay, which is, you know, the seacoast kind of area, it's a resort area that's in our community, they're having a sandcastle festival. So why don't we build a sandcastle? And they like to, the name of the congregation is Zion, so they have this flaming Z, you know, which is kind of bizarre, but anyway, it's mostly older people. So here on the beach, I think all of us except somebody's grandson were over 60, on our hands and knees in the rain making this Z. And we were, of course, the only church that was doing this. So we ended up getting second prize in the business section because they didn't have anything else besides that. But so we took some pictures of it because it was a crazy kind of thing. The Synod featured it in the front page of their you know, weekly update kind of thing, because it was like, oh, we thought Zion was dying out. Well, they're digging in the sand, and you know, and it was a kind of public witness. You know, people would come by. Well, oh, you're from that church, you know, that's hid away on that country road or whatever. So yeah, I think it. I'm not sure it speaks directly to what you're asking, Jim, but I think. And I've talked with a lot of the other pastors in that area. It's like, well, we don't quite know who's a member. Well, so-and-so goes here most of the time, but they're really still a member at Zion, or vice versa, you know. And so, you know, to have a strict rule of, you know, baptize, you know, you contribute and attend. Well, they attend in other ways, you know. And so it's, you know, again, I'm not necessarily furthering that as what everyone should try to aspire to, you know, because I'm trying to make some sense of it too, of how do you figure out who is in a room. But certainly it's a very permeable boundary as to who is or is not part of that church. And quite frankly, very few of them are, you know, they've been Lutherans for their life, you know, they're for everything else. In fact, one of the women, I'm talking about a conservative country congregation, but one of the women who, she's now down in Mexico, she's married to a Mexican, and they're wanting their kids to become bilingual this year, so they're not there for this year. But 2 years ago, she came to the previous pastor, who also was a woman, and said, well, I'm kind of a neo-pagan, you think? the church here would accept me. She's a very poetic, she really has a deeply Lutheran ethos, which she's discovering. You know, but normally if your cousin comes and says, oh, I'm a real pagan, can I join your church? Normal. You know, it's like, come on. So, you know, there's a sense in which I think the initiation into the life of the church can come through some different ways than the predictable ones. I mean, that doesn't mean that they aren't, you know, that there aren't some clear understandings of what it means to be church, but you don't necessarily start with that and then say, oh, you're not going to be active. But it's a church out there that, in a sense, people say, oh, yeah, there's something happening here. Gee, maybe I'll check this out.
Lee and then Corinne.
As I was listening and thinking about the fragmenting and connecting that you spoke of, I think about our language and the use of churches versus congregations and being a part of the church, the one holy Catholic and apostolic, and how our language, we call ourselves the church, and this is the church, and that's the church, when we're congregations that are part of one church, and how we forming our language instead of churches, calling ourselves congregations, and referring to ourselves as one. Do you see that happening, or is that a helpful way of making connections to those others?
Yeah, no, I think what you're pointing to is really key at that. I mean, it's very frustrating because I look at the Lutheran congregations in our area, and there's still a real silo kind of tendency. You know, this church and that church, and you know, I know in some places there's much more of a working together and whatever, but it's you know, one of our downtown churches, we discovered they're about to foreclose and they voted to sell their building. Well, it's an prime place for rich ministry. So some of us are saying, let's talk about this together. You know, the pastor has pretty much suffered, and I mean suffered. He hasn't been paid for 3 months. You know, and now he's also being a convert, but he hasn't shared this. So we're saying, let's talk about this together. You know, what does it mean to be church in this setting? And I think to really free up people to think in new ways about that is a challenge. But yeah, you know, we're this church, I go to this church and that church, and, you know, yeah. But I think to change that language is a real, you know, people are so used to the way they refer to their church that it will take a little, you know, how to shift that is, I think, a real challenge. The book, The Church Event by Dill, I think is very interesting. There's some very provocative ways of putting that together.
You talked about, you said that we're transformed by those who are most different from ourselves. And the church that I grew up in, of which I'm no longer a part of, because it left the LCA, and the church left that church after it left the LCA, or remained part of the LCA. But I was a member of that church until I was about 20 years old. And that congregation, when I think about the opportunities that they've had to be with people who are different from themselves, it's just not there. When they did a study on Islam, a congregation member asked, well, aren't all Muslims in the U.S. just sleeper cells? And one of my mentors, my confirmation mentor, asked me when I came back from college and told her about my new friends, that I had several friends from Africa. She asked, and this is her words, would you ever marry a Negro? And most recently, when I went home last time, I was with, again, this mentor who is a wonderful friend of mine, 86 years old. She told me about a woman walked into the church one Sunday that no one recognized, no one talked to her, she sat down, and she screamed in the middle of the sermon, and people were trying to quiet her down. She was mentally unstable, and they escorted her out and locked the door behind her. So this is not, that's only 3 instances from one small, rather rural church. And I'm wondering, what is the first step to take to help people see that we need to be with others who are different, to to be transformed. Otherwise, the doors are going to be locked. So what is the first step?
I think first step is in the preaching. I mean, it's hard to preach much from the Gospels without seeing that being challenged again and again in terms of what Jesus was about. But I think just in terms of other, I don't know, maybe some of the rest of you want to pitch in at this point too, but I think that's how to break through that is really a challenge. I certainly don't want to presume in any way suggest that this little church I'm serving right now has got it either. But they have in some ways. A colleague of mine from Geneva, Priscilla, who you know, Priscilla Singh, came to visit, and I said, oh, well, you're going to be there on Sunday. Why don't we preach a sermon together? Well, they heard things that they're still talking about a year later, because it's like, wow, we don't know that. And just this last week, I had one of the men who was very active saying, wow, how can we have more of those experiences with people who are so different from ourselves? Because he says, that just really will change us, how we see things, how they hear the gospel. So it's, how can the good news be heard from those perspectives that are quite different from their own? I mean, I think there's plenty of, if you don't have the actual, people don't have the experiences, the stories, and how those stories can come alive. I find in my preaching that even if I don't have it in the manuscript for that day, it's like, oh, that triggers something, and I think of some experience, and then that somehow gets woven in there. And I think again, I don't live in, maybe in the part of the country you're talking about, but at the same time, I think in most communities, there's far more encounter or possibilities of encountering people who are different from themselves than people realize. They're there. I mean, I walked into this, I said, oh my goodness, this is such a strange experience because this is a bunch of rural people that I don't know the first thing to relate to them. Well, I discovered the old farmer, he's got a Sikh temple in the backyard, and he helps the Sikhs while the neighbors are throwing rocks at them. How do you lift that up? How do you lift up those who are really working with immigrants and discover, and those aren't necessarily stories you're going to hear. They may not be the stories that they bring to the congregation, but you discover, there's something going on there. And I'm seeing somebody I met last night who was from my hometown near there, and I still remember, I'm from Wausau, Wisconsin, and a lot of the Wong and other people that were settled there, and I had been on the St. Olaf Global Semester, so I had been in these hill tribe villages, and I couldn't believe it, the racist things of, all the ducks that are being killed on the Wisconsin River or whatever. I mean, that was, in some ways it was important, and again, I wasn't there that long to be able to bring the alternative testimony, but I think it is a matter of when people express some of that. First of all, we have to kind of tell ourselves, oh, I'm not going to just respond and react right away. But let them talk for a while and get beyond, what is it about that they fear? And then when they start talking, they realize, well, there's a contradiction between what I fear and what the reality is. Then they begin to see. That's why I'm saying the seeing is not just our seeing or telling them, but giving the space, the permission for people to begin to name that and to expose that. And then then I think people connect and make some connections with one another that we as relative outsiders to that reality might not be able to make. But they know, because and here I think it's because, many of the salt of the earth people in our typical Lutheran congregations, have well been, immersed in what the faith is all about. Yeah, they live by all these, as your class today was, all these other civil religion and all the other symbols that are there. But if we open up the space for them to talk about their realities, then I think, yeah, I'm really immersed in what that Jesus story is all about. And let that come to the fore, and not just say, oh, well, now we get back to the real world. Well, that's, again, another reason why I say we need to begin with the world, and not just add that as kind of the end chapter after we get our act together as a church, which we never will.
Time for one more. Turner?
Thank you so much for your very encouraging lecture. And it's good to follow the words, seeing, remembering, connecting, and having each term gets so much picture or so much material. I come from a country where the church represents pretty much 80% of the community, where those who would be selling coals and making the harbor are likely to be centered people in the community of the church itself, where those who have led our country into financial despair, those who have held off the statements that we have seen at best to be lies, at worst to be illusions, or maybe the vice versa. How do we proceed with the healing, maintaining, or preserving community when all the key players are within the same community of confession? Sincere, honest, yet so incredibly simple. I don't know if this is a question, but it's you make me feel very torn in a positive way. It's almost an impossible task when you think of it, yet it is a task that has to be addressed. How do we maintain community where the congregation represents the world itself, which I think is true for a lot of small community congregations?
When I was talking about this coal terminal struggle, one of the things that's happened in the last 2 weeks, actually, is the coming together of this coalition with some faith leaders and union leaders. Now, those of us who are faith leaders in that, I think one could say we're pretty solidly opposed to this. And the labor leaders are saying, yes, we're for this. Again, because the corporation got to them early. But some of them have privately said, well, if this is not going to be good for our community, we're not going to stay with that. I think, I'm not used to being a pastor in situations where there's a lot of those real movers and shakers there. Now, it's going to be an interesting thing because the congregation that provide the endowment for this visiting professorship that I'll be at in Philadelphia, where Norma was 2 years ago, is a congregation where when we were working on the economic life statement of the ELCA in the mid-90s, we had a hearing there, an all-day hearing on economic justice and whatever. And the pastor, who's taken very seriously the ministry and daily life theme, he's no longer living, gathered people who literally were some of the movers and shakers on Wall Street, who are members of that congregation. And so we had one of our businessmen say, oh, I'll be able to talk their language, whatever. They got there. They wanted to bare their souls. They wanted to really talk about their struggles. Unfortunately, my husband isn't here because I tell the story too much. You say, oh, you're making them sound too good. But I think it was genuine. And actually, I'll have to do something at that congregation when I'm in Florida.
I was there in
Yeah.
that congregation right after Osama bin Laden was killed,
Yeah.
and they wanted to talk about 9/11 because they had experienced it, and they were burying their souls that night.
Okay, okay. So in other words, I would say, and there's actually, it's something I'm going to be doing for the Lutheran Episcopal Theologians Gathering tomorrow afternoon. I don't have that talk here right now. But a book by Krista Friedland called Plutocracy, which is what she names as the reality now, with, you know, especially in light of the huge amounts of money that was, you know, poured into the political campaigns. You know, the rule of the wealthy really is what we're facing in many ways. And she's a financial reporter who has really talked with a lot of these who are, you know, say, you know, and goes at the logic of, well, what we're doing is good. You know, this will benefit the community or whatever. And so she actually exposes that in a way that suggests, again, some theological connections with those realities. You know, I don't in any way want to suggest that the challenge that you're posing is an easy one. But I think there are ways of connecting or reframing some of these issues when it's like, well, okay, here's the corporations and here's the people affected. Now, how do, you know, is it possible to think of that in some other ways? I don't want to be romantic about that because clearly we're talking about huge financial interests that are controlling those decisions. And that's why our coalition, when we gathered, say, well, it's okay to talk about faith communities and labor communities, trying to cut through some new ground for the sake of common good. But it was a Hispanic organizer who worked with Cesar Chavez who spoke up, and she says, well, but we're just kidding ourselves. We can do all the agreement we want to, but it's these large corporations, you know, and the influence that they're bringing to this community that are really, this is the issue at stake. And she was right. So I don't know. I think, you know, what you're opening up is the big challenge of all of that, rather than just demonizing. The other thing I want to say along this line, and probably going overboard, is over time, but when I first really started working on the communal theme and how would that different understanding of church make a difference, is when there were farmers between Canada and Montana, I think it was, wheat farmers who were on opposite sides of some trade issue with regard to wheat. And I remember so something was happening at LSTC and I was throwing out the challenge. What would it mean to realize that sense of being communion so that those farmers on both sides of that border, and there's quite a few Lutherans on both sides of that border, you know, were to say, how do we go about this differently? Because they literally were shooting at each other. It was an all-out, it was a pretty tense kind of situation. So how do we reframe the way in which some of these issues are played out? And I think there's a strength that we can bring out of our biblical theological understandings that can make that different. Not overnight, but at least trying to frame it differently. You know, that certainly doesn't mean that there aren't also times when we just have to be clearer in denouncing, you know, how, well, the greed, you know, the greed, and all the other things, you know, and again, I think here, Luther and others had some pretty strong words, you know, and, but how do we do it so it's not just, oh, yeah, that's Karen speaking up, and, you know, I'm in a congregation right now where we don't want to hear any politics from the sermon. Well, again, how do you find politics, you know? And, you know, but at the same time, I was dealing Sunday with the widow's mite and the fact that that really has to be connected with the scribes, the exploitation that was going on of the widows. You have to keep those two halves of that text together. And so I was really talking about that. And one of the recent members is a recently retired banker. Another was actually a stockbroker. And both of them said, thank you for that. We needed to hear that. So in other words, I think sometimes people who are in the center of those positions, you know, and again, it wasn't that I was condemning them, but I was struggling with them, saying religious leaders, you know, we fall into this, economic leaders, political leaders. And then that struggling together, I think, can happen in some meaningful ways. But again, there has to be the space and the relationship building that makes that possible.
Invite Karen Russell forward, for whom, by the way, in a public way, I'm extremely grateful for all of the work this semester. So, Karen.
I want to thank all of you for coming this evening and last evening and earlier this semester, and would hope that you'll continue to attend functions as they come available. I would like you to join me in thanking Karen for her sharing.